What would you do if the seat you paid for, the seat you were assigned, suddenly became a question of whether you belonged there? For Adrian Cole, a respected CEO, that moment came high above the clouds, a simple request from a flight attendant spiraling into a scene that would ignite a national conversation. But this isn't just one man's story. It's about the quiet moments of judgment that happen every day, in places we think are neutral. It's about how a single look, a single question, can carry the weight of history. What happens when the one person being targeted also happens to run the airline? How far will he go to challenge the very system he leads, and what will it cost him? From tense confrontations in the cabin to uncomfortable truths in closed-door meetings, this is the journey of a man who refused to look away, and a company forced to decide which sky it wants to fly in. Stay tuned, because the story you're about to hear might just change how you look at your next boarding pass. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss a single moment of this story. The soft murmur of Gate D14 at Phoenix Sky Harbor carried the rhythm of 100 small lives colliding for a moment in time. Rolling suitcases clattered over the industrial carpet. The smell of fresh brewed coffee drifted from a kiosk across the concourse, mixing with the faint scent of jet fuel that seeped through the airlocks. Adrian Cole sat quietly in a low leather chair near the priority boarding lane, a slim hardback book resting in his hands. His black-framed reading glasses caught the light from the window beside him. Outside, the aircraft waited tea. Skybridge Airlines' newest Boeing 787 gleaming white with the gold and blue tail he had personally approved years ago. Few people here would realize that the man in seat 2A was the one who signed off on the purchase order. He dressed without flash, pressed khaki trousers, a navy crewneck sweater over a crisp collared shirt, and well-worn brown leather shoes polished just enough to show care. The outfit was deliberate, casual enough to blend in, but neat enough to invite subtle judgment. Adrian had long ago learned that sometimes the most revealing truths about people surfaced when they thought they were speaking to just another passenger. A boarding announcement crackled overhead, cheerful but efficient. Skybridge Airlines Flight 218 to New York JFK is now pre-boarding our first-class and premium business-class passengers. Adrian closed his book with a soft thud, marking his place with a folded ticket stub. He rose, slinging a compact leather bag over his shoulder, and walked toward the boarding lane. The gate agent scanned his boarding pass with a practiced smile. "Have a great flight. Mr. Cole," she said, reading his name without recognition of what it meant. He nodded, returning the smile. The jet bridge hummed with recycled air and the faint scent of ozone. The moment Adrian stepped into the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. Plush seats in a 2x2 configuration, soft lighting calibrated to a warm amber glow. The overhead bins gleamed like polished shells. He reached row 2, seat A, and placed his bag in the overhead compartment. Sliding into the wide seat, he let his gaze wander. Seat 2B was empty for now. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored gray suit was already checking emails on a tablet. The hum of boarding continued in waves behind him. That was when she appeared. Kara Whitfield stepped into the aisle from the galley, tall, poised, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. Her smile was professional, but her eyes swept over him with a flicker of hesitation. She approached slowly, stopping at his row. "Good afternoon, sir," she said. The tone was polite, yet carried an edge of formality sharpened to a point. "May I see your boarding pass?" Adrian looked up from adjusting the seatbelt. "Of course," he replied calmly, handing it over without fuss. She examined the pass, glanced at the seat number, then back at him. You're In 2A, she asked, as if clarifying something improbable. That's correct. Kara's lips tightened slightly. This section is reserved for our business class passengers, she said, her voice just loud enough for the man in 3B Colin Radford, though Adrian did not know his name yet, to look up from his magazine with mild interest. Adrian's gaze remained steady. I am a business class passenger. Behind her, a few other travelers slowed as they stowed bags, sensing a ripple in the boarding routine. Colin smirked faintly, leaning toward his seatmate and muttering something that drew a quiet chuckle. Kara flipped the boarding pass over in her hands, scanning the barcode again as though a second look might change the data. Do you have a receipt for this ticket? She asked, still in that measured tone. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, inhaling. He could already feel the cabin watching not openly, but in the sidelong glances, the quick averting of eyes when caught. It was the same choreography he had seen in countless forms. He smiled gently. The boarding pass is the receipt. Kara hesitated, then straightened. I'll just confirm with the manifest. Please remain seated for now. As she walked briskly toward the galley, Colin's smirk widened. He tapped his foot against the carpet, muttering, Some folks always try their luck. Adrian didn't respond. He adjusted his seat back slightly and reached for his book, though his attention was no longer on the printed words. From the corner of his eye, he saw a younger flight attendant, Talia Morgan, watching from the forward galley doorway. Her brow was furrowed, lips pressed in uncertainty. She stepped forward half a pace, then stopped. Adrian's mind ticked through possibilities. Was this a misunderstanding that would resolve quickly, or the opening act of something far more telling? He'd learned to wait, to let people's choices play out in the open before he intervened. The boarding flow continued, passengers filing past, oblivious or deliberately so. Kara returned, the boarding pass still in her hand. Sir, she began, her voice pitched slightly higher now. Could you step into the aisle for a moment? Adrian remained seated. Is there a problem? We're just verifying your seating. I need to check something with the captain. Her tone was firm, but the edges were fraying. She was aware of the watching eyes now, too. Adrian studied her for a long beat, then inclined his head. I'll wait here, he said quietly. You can bring the captain to me. Kara's jaw tightened. She turned sharply and walked toward the cockpit. From 3B, Colin's voice floated over again. This should be interesting. Adrian allowed himself a slow breath. He reached for the folded ticket stub in his book, feeling the familiar indentation of the paper. He thought briefly of the last letter he had read from a Skybridge passenger, a woman describing how a flight attendant had doubted her seat assignment until a white colleague vouched for her. That letter had ended with a plea. Please, Mr. Cole, make sure this doesn't keep happening. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, as if marking time. Not yet, he thought. Let's see who speaks. Outside. The sun slipped behind a bank of clouds, and the cabin lights warmed another shade. Boarding announcements echoed faintly from the terminal, distant but still within reach. Adrian sat perfectly still, a calm center in the growing tension. Somewhere forward, the sound of the cockpit door closing was followed by quiet footsteps heading back down the aisle. The moment was not over. It was only beginning. The cabin door clicked shut with a muted thud, sealing the atmosphere inside. Passengers were still settling in, tugging at seat belts and sliding bags under seats, the small sounds layering over the soft hum of the air system. Adrian remained in 2A, posture relaxed but mind running at its usual calculated pace. He could feel the ripple Kara Whitfield had left in her wake. It wasn't loud, not like a public confrontation in a crowded street, but in the intimate space of a business-class cabin, the ripple might as well have been a shout. She reappeared, the boarding pass still in her hand, and positioned herself in the aisle just far enough to command attention. Her chin tilted slightly upward. "Sir, I spoke with the manifest officer. There seems to be some discrepancy." Adrian's eyes met hers. His voice, even and measured, was the kind that left no room for raised volume. "What discrepancy?" "Miss Whitfield." The use of her name made her pause. It was small, but enough to break the rhythm she'd been rehearsing in her head. She glanced down at the paper, as if to confirm her ground. "Our records indicate a passenger with your name in economy class. Are you sure you didn't receive an upgrade at check-in from across the aisle?" Colin Radford leaned back in his seat, one arm draped over the armrest, watching with thinly veiled amusement. "Must have been a lucky day," he murmured, not to Adrian, but just loud enough for him to hear. Adrian didn't look at him. "I purchased this seat directly from Skybridge 2 weeks ago. Full fare." Kara's expression remained fixed in professional neutrality, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else: skepticism, maybe annoyance. "I'll just need to verify that with our system." She stepped closer, lowering her voice but keeping it within earshot of the front rows. "I'm sure you understand. Sometimes these things happen." Adrian's hands rested loosely on the armrests. "I do understand," he said, "and I also understand that the manifest is rarely wrong." Her brows drew together for the briefest moment. "Just a few minutes," she said, retreating toward the galley again. The man in 3B let out a soft chuckle. "Guess they're making sure you're not stealing my legroom." His seatmate, a younger man in a navy blazer, shifted uncomfortably and gave him a subtle elbow nudge. Colin ignored it. From her position near the beverage station, Talia Morgan watched the exchange with a knot tightening in her chest. She'd seen passengers questioned before over luggage, boarding times, upgrades, but this was different. The tone was different. And it was all happening in front of the entire cabin. She moved toward the manifest display screen, her fingers tapping quickly through the passenger list. There it was, clear as day. Adrian Cole, 2A, business class, booking code YS4 Premium, full fare, no upgrade notation, no standby code. She knew this was solid. The data didn't lie. Talia turned, boarding pass still on the screen, but Kara intercepted her. "Talia." "I've got this," Kara said sharply, her voice low but tight. "I just checked the manifest." Talia replied, "It matches exactly. There's no mistake." Kara's lips pressed into a thin line. "We need to follow procedure. Let me handle it." Talia hesitated, eyes flicking toward Adrian. He was watching her now, a calm focus in his gaze, not pleading, not demanding, just present. She stepped back reluctantly, though her stomach churned. Adrian leaned slightly toward the aisle, catching Talia's eye. "Thank you," he said, the 2 words quiet, but weighted. Kara returned once more, now holding a tablet. "I've escalated this to the captain," she announced. "He'll come back shortly to review the situation." Adrian tilted his head, studying her. "The situation," he repeated, as though tasting the word. "Yes," she said, voice clipped. "We need to ensure seating integrity for all passengers." Colin's smirk deepened. "We appreciate you keeping the standards up," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Adrian finally turned toward him, his expression unchanged. "And what standard do you believe is being upheld here?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Colin opened his mouth, then closed it, settling for a faint shrug. Just making sure everything's fair. Fairness, Adrian said softly, is an interesting choice of word. Kara broke in. Let's wait for the captain. Sir? She pivoted toward the cockpit, leaving the tension behind like static in the air. Adrian leaned back, the leather creaking beneath him. He reached for the small notebook tucked into his bag, flipping it open to a fresh page. His pen hovered for a moment before he began to write. Not notes about the incident yet, but a few stray thoughts, phrases, words. Sometimes the outlines of action began as fragments. Talia stepped closer from the galley, her voice low. I'm sorry, she said. I should have. He lifted a hand slightly, stopping her. You'll know when the right moment comes, he said. Courage has its own clock. Her throat tightened. She nodded, retreating to her jump seat, though she didn't take her eyes off the aisle. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the last few passengers boarded. The air grew still, the sound of the terminal fading to a muffled hum beyond the closed door. Adrian glanced toward the cockpit. Any moment now, the captain would arrive, and the line between misunderstanding and something larger would become clear. In the back of his mind, the letter from that passenger replayed. Please, Mr. Cole, make sure this doesn't keep happening. The words weren't a request anymore. They were an expectation, one he had agreed to carry the moment he read them. Kara's heels clicked softly on the aisle carpet as she returned with Captain Edward Sloane. The captain's stride was measured, his expression professionally blank. He stopped beside Adrian's seat. Mr. Cole, he began. We've had a report of a possible seating error. Adrian met his gaze. And what does your manifest say? Captain Sloane glanced at the tablet Kara held. She angled it toward him, scrolling with her thumb. His eyes flicked over the details, and for a fraction of a second his expression shifted recognition, then something else. He straightened. I see, he said slowly. Adrian closed the notebook in his lap. Do you? Kara's posture stiffened. Captain, I just wanted to confirm. Sloane held up a hand. We'll address this, he said, his tone firm. He looked at Adrian again. We appreciate your patience, sir. Adrian inclined his head. Patience is easy when you've had practice. The captain gave a short nod and turned back toward the cockpit. Kara followed, her steps faster now, her shoulders tight. Adrian exhaled quietly, his hand resting on the closed notebook. Around him, the cabin seemed to lean ever so slightly toward him, not with movement, but with attention. Even Colin had stopped smirking. Adrian let the silence settle, the hum of the air system filling the space. In the stillness, he could feel the story forming, not as a single moment, but as part of a much longer thread. And he had no intention of letting it fray unseen. The cockpit door closed behind Captain Sloane with a muted click. The low, steady hum of the aircraft filled the gap he left. Kara Whitfield remained in the forward galley for a moment, speaking in hushed tones to another crew member, her words just out of reach. Adrian Cole sat motionless in 2A, but inside, the gears of his mind were already turning. He was no stranger to this kind of moment. The faces changed. The settings varied: conference rooms, board meetings, hotel lobbies, and yes, more than a few airplanes, but the pattern was always the same: an assumption, a challenge, a public test of belonging. He opened his leather notebook again, the pen poised above the page. He didn't start writing immediately. Instead, he let the quiet work in his favor. Every so often, silence has a way of drawing the truth toward it. Behind him, Colin Radford rustled the pages of his in-flight magazine. "You know," Colin said casually, "it's nothing personal. They just have to keep the riffraff out of the good seats." Adrian didn't turn around. "Is that what you think this is?" Colin gave a low chuckle. "What else could it be?" Adrian considered replying, but decided against it. Words spent too early were like playing the final hand before the table was even set. Instead, he made a single note in his book, "Observe longer." From the galley. Talia Morgan emerged, her movements purposeful. She approached, kneeling slightly so her voice would carry only to him. "Mr. Cole," she said softly, "the manifest confirms everything. Your name, your seat, your fare code. There's no error." "I know," Adrian replied. She hesitated, then asked, "Then why let this keep going?" Adrian's gaze met hers. "Because I want to see who will speak when they don't have to. That tells me more than any policy manual ever could." Talia absorbed that for a moment before nodding. She returned to the galley but kept glancing back toward him, the question still written across her face. Adrian leaned back in his seat, eyes drifting toward the window. The tarmac bustled with movement luggage carts zipping past, a fuel truck pulling away, a line of orange-vested ground crew guiding another aircraft to the adjacent gate. In his mind, he recalled a letter from just 3 weeks prior. It had come from a Skybridge passenger, a retired teacher named Gloria Sanders. She had written in neat cursive on lined paper, describing an incident where she'd been asked to prove she belonged in first class. The attendant had apologized later, but the sting remained. The letter ended with, "I wonder how many others just endure it silently." Adrian closed his eyes briefly. That question was the reason he had worn the simple sweater and old leather shoes today. It wasn't just a trip from Phoenix to New York. It was a deliberate test of the very system he had promised to make better. From the front of the cabin, Kara reappeared. She was smiling again, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Cole, the captain has asked me to confirm a few details with you directly." Adrian gestured for her to continue. "Can I see a form of identification?" she asked. Voice even, but pitched just loud enough for the front rows to hear. He reached into his bag and withdrew a slim leather wallet. From it, he slid a driver's license and a black metal card engraved with the Skybridge corporate crest and his name. He handed both to her without comment. Kara glanced at the license, then at the corporate card. Her brows twitched upward for a fraction of a second before she caught herself. She held the card a moment longer than necessary, perhaps deciding how much to acknowledge. "Thank you," she said finally, returning them. "We're still verifying with operations." Adrian took back the cards, placing them deliberately on the fold-out tray before him. "You might find operations knows me better than you think." For the first time, Kara's composure wavered. She shifted her weight, then offered a polite nod before retreating again. Across the aisle, Colin leaned toward his seatmate. "Some folks just can't take a hint," he whispered, not nearly quietly enough. The younger man beside him glanced at Adrian, then back at Colin. "Maybe the hint's not for him," he said under his breath. Adrian heard it, and for the first time since boarding, a faint smile touched his lips. The minutes stretched. Boarding had long since finished, but the aircraft remained at the gate. A few passengers checked their watches, murmuring to each other. The sense of delay was beginning to settle over the cabin like a thin layer of fog. Adrian tapped a quick message into his phone. 3 words, sent to only one recipient, code Indigo active. The message was for Victor Liang, his COO. Within seconds, the typing dots appeared in reply. Location Adrian sent back Flight 218. Gate D14, now. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned his attention to the cabin. Talia emerged again, this time offering him a glass of water. "I'm sorry for the delay," she said quietly. He took the glass. "You have nothing to apologize for," he replied. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement through the forward windows, a black SUV pulling up alongside the jet bridge. He knew that vehicle. It was Skybridge's on-site executive transport, the one reserved for urgent operational matters. Inside the cabin, the tension had shifted. Conversations quieted as passengers sensed something unfolding, even if they didn't understand the details. Kara was in the galley again, speaking rapidly into a handset, her free hand running through her bun in a gesture of stress. Adrian sipped his water, unhurried. He wasn't here to embarrass anyone in the moment. He was here to see the choices they made when they thought they held the authority. And soon, every choice would be visible. The interphone chimed softly, and Kara disappeared into the cockpit. Less than a minute later, she emerged with Captain Sloan at her side. His face was more serious now. He scanned the cabin, then approached Adrian directly. "Mr. Cole," he said, "we've been asked to hold departure briefly. Operations is sending a representative on board." Adrian nodded once. "Good," Colin muttered. "What?" "Now you've got your lawyer coming." Adrian didn't turn toward him. "No," he said. "Someone with more authority than that." Before Colin could reply, the front cabin door opened. The sharp scent of cooler terminal air swept in, followed by the unmistakable presence of Victor Liang. He stepped inside, wearing a tailored Navy suit, his Skybridge ID clipped visibly to his jacket. 2 airport operations supervisors followed close behind. Victor's gaze swept the cabin once before locking on Adrian. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the first few rows to hear. "Are you comfortable?" Adrian set down his glass. "I will be," he replied. Victor turned to Captain Sloan. "We need a quick word with your lead attendant." Kara's cheeks flushed faintly as she followed Victor and the supervisors into the galley. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, questions passing between strangers. Talia stood near her jump seat, eyes fixed on the galley door. Adrian leaned back again, closing his notebook. The moment he had been waiting for was here. The pieces were on the board, and soon everyone would see the game for what it really was. And this time, the ending would not be written in silence. The galley curtain swayed faintly as Victor Liang and the operations supervisors stepped inside with Kara Whitfield. The muted sound of their voices carried just enough to signal that this was no casual conversation. Passengers craned their necks, curiosity overtaking polite disinterest. Adrian Cole remained still in his seat, hands folded loosely in his lap. His breathing was steady. He knew that once Victor was involved, the matter would be handled decisively, but the handling was only part of the point. The other part was the witnessing. A few minutes passed. From the galley came the low cadence of Victor's voice, the clipped replies of Kara, the interjections of the supervisors. Then a sharper note, Victor's voice, firmer now. "The manifest confirms him. Your own colleague confirmed him. And you chose to escalate." There was a pause. Then Kara's reply, lower, almost inaudible. Victor's tone shifted again, cool but edged. "No, this isn't a misunderstanding. It's a judgment call you made, and you made it wrong." The curtain parted. Kara emerged first, her posture rigid, eyes fixed on the far wall of the cabin as if she could will herself invisible. Victor followed, his expression neutral, but his presence unmistakably in control. The 2 supervisors trailed behind, their eyes scanning the passengers. Victor stopped beside Adrian's seat. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice pitched to carry without shouting, "your seating was never in question. The delay is over. You'll have a comfortable flight." Adrian looked up at him. "I'm sure I will." Then, without breaking eye contact with Victor, Adrian spoke just loud enough for the rows around them to hear, "But I'd like to know why it was ever in question in the first place." The words landed like a dropped glass sharp, unexpected, impossible to ignore. Several passengers turned in their seats. Talia, still at her jump seat, lifted her chin slightly, her eyes locking on Kara. Victor's reply was deliberate. "That's a conversation we'll have in full when we're on the ground, and it will be had." Adrian nodded slowly. "Good, because I don't believe in leaving important matters at 30,000 feet. Kara's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't speak. It was Colin Radford who broke the silence, his voice casual but tinged with smugness. "Well, at least we can all get moving now. Some of us have places to be." Adrian turned his head, meeting Colin's gaze for the first time in full. "And some of us," he said evenly, "have things to learn." The remark silenced Colin for the moment, though the corners of his mouth twitched like he was holding back a retort. Victor gave Adrian a small nod before moving toward the cockpit to speak with Captain Sloane. The supervisors followed, leaving Kara to stand alone in the aisle. For a heartbeat, she looked as if she might say something. Instead, she turned toward the galley, disappearing again behind the curtain. The cabin's mood shifted. It was subtle but undeniable. The air felt charged. The unspoken acknowledgement passing between passengers that they had just witnessed something bigger than a seating dispute. A woman in row 4 leaned forward, speaking across the aisle. "Excuse me," she said to Adrian. "I just want you to know. I saw how she treated you. It wasn't right." Adrian regarded her with a faint smile. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate you saying that." She nodded once, then settled back into her seat, but her eyes remained on him for another moment before turning forward. Talia approached quietly. "You handled that differently than I expected," she said. Adrian tilted his head. "How did you expect I don't know?" she admitted. "I guess that you'd push back harder in the moment." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes the harder push comes from letting the other person walk far enough to realize they've lost the ground under them." Talia considered that, her brow furrowed. "That's a lot of patience." "Patience," Adrian said, "isn't passive. It's choosing your moment." Before Talia could reply, the intercom crackled overhead. Captain Sloane's voice came through, calm but authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience during the short delay. We are now cleared for departure and will be pushing back momentarily." The announcement broke the tension slightly. The usual pre-takeoff bustle resuming, passengers adjusted seatbacks, tucked bags away, and reached for magazines. But the earlier undercurrent hadn't gone anywhere. It was just submerged beneath the surface for now. As the aircraft began to push back from the gate, Adrian glanced out the window at the tarmac rolling slowly by. He knew the rest of the flight would proceed without further interruption, not because the issue was resolved, but because it was paused. The real resolution would come later, and it would not be confined to this cabin. He thought about Gloria Sanders, about her letter, about how many Glorias had sat quietly, deciding whether the discomfort of speaking up was worth the backlash. And he thought about the ones who never wrote at all, who simply carried the memory like a stone in their pocket. The engines spooled up, a deep vibration running through the floor. The safety demonstration began. Kara's voice reciting the familiar script over the PA. Her tone was steady, but to Adrian's ear, there was a trace of strain, a note she hadn't quite tuned out. Talia moved through the aisle, checking seat belts, her gaze softening when she reached Adrian's row. No words passed between them, but the acknowledgement was there. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Adrian leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He could feel the cabin's watchful attention, even in the quiet. The incident had left a mark, and not just on him. He wasn't here to humiliate Kara or to turn the passengers into an audience for revenge. That had never been the goal. The goal was to create a moment that lingered, a question that each witness would carry with them long after the seatbelt sign went off. Why did they think he didn't belong? And perhaps, more importantly, what would they do the next time they saw it happen to someone else? The aircraft turned onto the runway, the engines rising to a steady roar. The acceleration pressed him gently into the seat. As they lifted into the air, the city lights fell away beneath them, replaced by the deep indigo of the evening sky. Adrian opened his eyes, looking straight ahead. The climb was smooth, but he knew turbulence was still coming, only not the kind the weather could cause. For now, he would wait. The seatbelt sign stayed on longer than usual after takeoff. The aircraft climbed steadily through smooth air. The cabin lights dimmed to a muted glow. Business class had gone quiet, except for the soft rustle of newspapers and the occasional click of a seatbelt buckle. Adrian Cole sat motionless, watching the faint line of twilight fade through the window. His reflection looked back at him in the glass eyes, steady, posture relaxed, the image of a man at ease. But inside, threads of thought wove tight patterns, each one a different path forward from what had already happened. He wasn't replaying the confrontation with Kara Whitfield the way some might after such an incident. He was analyzing, cataloging each reaction from the moment she first approached him until Victor Liang stepped on board. Every word, every glance, every silence from the people around him, it was all data, and he knew what to do with data. From the galley. Kara's voice floated forward as she spoke to another attendant. The words weren't clear, but the tone carried that brittle edge of someone trying to sound composed. Talia Morgan appeared in the aisle, her service cart rolling quietly over the carpet. She stopped beside Adrian's seat, her expression neutral, but her voice low enough to be private. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked. "A coffee," he said. "Black." She poured it without looking away from him. "I don't think she's done," she murmured. "I know," Adrian replied. Talia set the coffee down carefully. "Why not just end it? You've got the authority. You could call her out right now." Adrian's gaze didn't waver. Authority only works if you understand the story it creates. Right now, the story is still unfolding. People are still deciding where they stand. She frowned. "You're giving them a choice." "I'm giving them a mirror," he said. Talia looked at him for a moment longer before moving down the aisle. Across from Adrian, Colin Radford had been pretending to focus on a magazine, but his curiosity got the better of him. "You really going to drag this out the whole flight?" he asked. Adrian took a slow sip of his coffee. "You say drag out, as if I started it." Colin shrugged. "You could have just moved and saved everyone the trouble." Adrian set his cup down. "And if I had, what lesson would that teach?" "That sometimes it's not worth the fight," Colin said. Adrian gave a faint smile. "Sometimes it's the only thing worth it." The hum of the engines filled the silence between them. A voice from behind interrupted Marilyn Frost, the retired teacher in 4C, leaning forward slightly. "He's right," she said to Colin. "If you don't push back, nothing changes." Colin glanced at her, then back at his magazine. "Maybe, or maybe you just make enemies." Marilyn's eyes narrowed slightly. "Better an enemy you can see than one who hides behind courtesy." Adrian met her gaze briefly, offering a small nod. She returned it with quiet firmness before settling back in her seat. Kara emerged from the galley, the faint scent of reheated bread rolls drifting ahead of her. Her smile was back, but there was no warmth in it. She served the row ahead of Adrian first, then turned toward him. "Mr. Cole," she said, "we appreciate your patience earlier." He looked up at her, his tone measured. "Is that an apology?" Her lips pressed together briefly. "It's an acknowledgement." "Of what? That there was a misunderstanding?" Adrian's eyes stayed on hers. "A misunderstanding about where I belong." Kara's smile faltered. She set a bread roll on his tray. "We're all just doing our jobs." "There's more than one way to do a job," Adrian replied. "Some honor the uniform, some don't." Her gaze flickered just for a heartbeat before she moved to the next passenger. Victor Liang passed quietly through the cabin a few minutes later, pausing beside Adrian's seat. "Operations is aware," he said under his breath. "I've logged the details myself. I'll handle the follow-up." Adrian shook his head slightly. "We'll handle it together. I want this addressed before we land." Victor gave a short nod and moved on. Dinner service began, and the rhythm of the cabin returned to something resembling normal. Yet the undercurrent hadn't gone anywhere. Passengers stole glances toward Adrian, toward Kara, toward Victor when he passed through. Even those who hadn't seen the beginning of the exchange seemed to sense there was more to the story than a simple seating dispute. Adrian ate slowly, not out of hesitation, but because his mind was elsewhere. He thought about how stories traveled not just in headlines, but in the casual retelling between strangers. The whispered, "Did you hear about what happened on that flight at some future dinner table?" He wanted this one to travel. When the trays were cleared, the cabin lights dimmed further. Most passengers settled in a reading or closed their eyes. The seatbelt sign was off now, and a few people moved quietly toward the lavatories. Kara approached again, this time without the practiced smile. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, "I didn't mean for things to escalate." Adrian studied her. "But you meant to challenge me." She hesitated. "I meant to follow procedure." "And what was the procedure?" "To verify seating assignments." "Even after your colleague confirmed mine," Kara glanced toward the galley, as if hoping for rescue. "It's not personal. It never is," Adrian said softly. "Until it is." For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then she straightened. "We're over the Rockies now. Smooth air ahead." Adrian gave a single nod, and she walked away. Talia returned minutes later, leaning slightly toward him. "You got to her," she said quietly. "No," Adrian replied. "She got to herself." The hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft adjusted course. Outside, the sky had gone completely dark, the faint lights of distant towns glimmering far below. Adrian closed his notebook without writing anything new. He didn't need to record every detail tonight. Some things were better remembered in their raw form. What mattered now was the landing. That was when the real turbulence would begin. The cabin had settled into that late-flight rhythm, low voices, the occasional clink of a glass, the soft shuffle of passengers stretching their legs. Somewhere forward, the faint smell of brewed coffee drifted through the air, blending with the cooler scent from the overhead vents. Adrian Cole sat with his seat reclined slightly, hands resting loosely on the armrests. But his eyes were open. He hadn't slept. Every moment since boarding was still sharp in his mind, each detail catalogued. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received clearance for our initial descent into New York JFK. Local time is 10:12 p. And weather on the ground is clear with a light breeze." The words hung in the air for a moment before the cabin began its subtle shift. Seat backs moved upright. Trays clicked closed. Bags were pulled from beneath seats. The quiet hum of preparation carried through the aisles. Adrian straightened in his seat, glancing toward the forward galley. Kara Whitfield was there, speaking to another crew member in low tones. She didn't look his way. Victor Liang was seated in the jump seat nearest the cockpit, his posture relaxed, but his gaze alert. Talia Morgan moved down the aisle, checking belts. When she reached Adrian's row, she paused. "We'll be on the ground soon," she said quietly. "I know," Adrian replied. She leaned slightly closer. "I have a feeling you're not planning to just walk off this plane." He gave her a faint smile, observant. "What exactly are you planning?" she asked. "Something that will matter beyond this flight." Talia studied him for a second, then gave a small nod and moved on. The descent continued, the engine pitch shifting as the aircraft angled lower. The lights of the eastern seaboard began to flicker in the distance through the windows. Adrian reached into his leather bag and took out his phone. He typed a short message to Victor. "Have them meet us at the gate." Victor read it without turning his head, his thumb tapping a quick reply. "Already arranged." The seatbelt sign chimed on. Kara stepped into the aisle, her voice steady over the PA as she reminded passengers to stow items and prepare for landing. She glanced briefly toward Adrian but said nothing. The city lights grew brighter, clusters of gold and white threading through the dark. The landing gear lowered with a muted thud beneath the floor, a vibration running up through the seat frames. The cabin tilted slightly as the aircraft lined up with the runway. The landing was smooth rubber meeting asphalt with a soft roar, reverse thrusters humming as the plane slowed. A few passengers murmured compliments to the captain. The familiar sense of relief after a safe arrival settled briefly over the cabin. But Adrian knew the real moment hadn't come yet. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Kara made the arrival announcement. Her tone was calm, but to Adrian's ear, there was still a thread of tension woven through it. She closed with the usual. "We thank you for flying with Skybridge Airlines and hope to see you again soon." The aircraft came to a stop. The chime sounded. Seatbelts unclicked. Overhead bins opened. The quiet was replaced with the rustle and chatter of people eager to leave. Adrian stayed seated. He watched as passengers stood, some casting quick glances his way. A few gave him small nods of acknowledgement as they passed. Marilyn Frost lingered briefly beside his seat. "I hope they do right by you," she said. "They will," Adrian replied. "And by more than me." Marilyn gave him a small, knowing smile before stepping into the aisle. Talia appeared again, standing beside his row. "The front is clear," she said softly. Adrian rose, taking his bag from the overhead. He moved forward at an unhurried pace, stepping into the galley area just as the last of the first-class passengers exited. Waiting at the open cabin door were three people in Skybridge executive uniforms, Victor Liang at their center, flanked by a senior HR director and an operations safety manager. Their presence was unmistakable. "Mr. Cole," Victor said, his voice pitched so it carried over the hum of the deplaning passengers. "We're ready to address the matter." Kara, still at her position near the cockpit, stiffened. Her eyes flickered between Victor and Adrian. Adrian didn't step aside. "This conversation," he said clearly, "isn't going to happen behind a closed door. Not this time." Victor inclined his head. "Your call." Adrian turned slightly toward the remaining passengers in business class, many of whom were still gathering their belongings. "Everyone here has seen enough to know this isn't about a seat," he said. "But not everyone has seen what happens after." Kara's face flushed. "Sir, with all due respect." "With all due respect," Adrian interrupted, "you made a choice today based on who you thought belonged here, and you made it without the facts, even after you were given them." A murmur rippled through the remaining passengers. Colin Radford shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Victor spoke next, his tone firm. "Kara, you will be relieved from duty effective immediately pending formal review. You'll be escorted from this aircraft by operations staff." Kara's mouth opened as if to argue, but the HR director stepped forward. "We'll discuss this in detail once we return to the crew center." Adrian's voice was steady, measured. "This isn't about humiliation. It's about clarity. Every passenger who witnessed this now knows what the airline stands for and what it will not tolerate." He stepped aside, allowing the operations manager to guide Kara toward the jet bridge. Her departure was quiet but unmistakable, the tension in the air easing slightly as she disappeared from view. Adrian looked at the passengers still watching. "When you leave this plane," he said, "you'll tell your version of what happened. Make sure it includes the ending." A few people nodded. Others simply looked thoughtful. Victor gestured toward the jet bridge. "We've got a car waiting." Adrian slung his bag over his shoulder, stepping off the plane without looking back. The cool night air of the terminal hit his face, and he inhaled deeply. It wasn't satisfaction, he felt it was resolve. There would be paperwork, meetings, procedural changes, but those were the surface ripples. The real work would be in ensuring that the next time someone was judged before they were even greeted. The ending would be different whether or not he was there to see it. The corridor from the jet bridge opened into a quiet section of Terminal 4, where a private conference room waited, its glass walls overlooking the dimly lit tarmac. The rest of JFK's bustle seemed far away. Just the muffled hum of air handlers and the occasional distant announcement bleeding through. Victor Liang held the door for Adrian Cole, the Skybridge HR director, Evelyn Shaw, and the operations safety manager, David Benton, followed. Kara Whitfield was already inside, seated stiffly at one end of the long table. Her posture was straight, her hands clasped tightly together, as though holding herself in place. Adrian placed his leather bag on the table, but didn't sit immediately. He took a slow look around the room, the glass, the view of the parked aircraft, the faint reflection of each person in the windows. The setting was sterile, but he could feel the undercurrent already. Victor gestured to the chairs. "We can get started." Adrian finally took a seat, choosing the center position along the long side of the table rather than the head. It was deliberate. He wanted no visual suggestion of a hierarchy that implied detachment. Evelyn cleared her throat. "We're here to address the incident on Flight 218. Kara, you've been informed of the seriousness of the situation." Kara nodded once, not meeting anyone's eyes. "Yes." Adrian leaned forward slightly. "Then we should skip rehearsed formalities and start with the simplest question." He looked directly at Kara. "Why did you question my seat assignment?" She hesitated, her gaze fixed on a point just above his shoulder. "It's standard to verify seating in certain cases." What cases? Adrian's tone was calm, but there was a sharpened edge beneath it. When something doesn't match what I expect, she said finally. Victor's brow furrowed. And what exactly didn't match your expectations tonight? Kara's eyes flickered. I didn't recognize him as a frequent passenger. Most of our business class passengers fit a certain profile. Adrian didn't move. Profile. Say what you mean. She swallowed hard. I didn't think you looked like someone who'd be in 2A. The room went still. Evelyn scribbled something in her notes, but didn't look up. David Benton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Adrian's voice was measured. And what exactly does someone in 2A look like to you? Kara's hands tightened again. I didn't mean... But you did, Adrian interrupted, still without raising his voice. You meant it enough to act on it, enough to override a colleague's confirmation, enough to suggest I step out of my seat and wait in the aisle so you could check with the captain. Kara's lips pressed into a thin line. Victor spoke next. His tone clipped. This isn't an isolated pattern, Kara. We've had prior feedback, not always formal complaints, but enough to establish a concern about passengers feeling singled out without clear cause. I wasn't trying to, Kara began, but Adrian held up a hand. Intent is the smallest part of impact, he said. Your choice wasn't just about me. It sent a signal to every passenger who saw it. It told them there's a gatekeeper deciding who fits here, and that gatekeeper uses something other than the manifest. Evelyn leaned forward. Kara, this is precisely the kind of behavior that creates liability for the airline. But more than that, it's corrosive to trust. We can train procedures. We can't train people to see what they refuse to see. Kara's voice was quieter now. I made a mistake. Adrian's gaze stayed fixed on her. A mistake is spilling coffee on a passenger's shirt. What you made was a choice, and choices can change, but only if you're willing to name them for what they are. She didn't answer. Victor looked to Adrian. What's your recommendation? Adrian sat back slightly, his eyes never leaving Kara. Temporary suspension pending retraining is the obvious minimum, but retraining without accountability is theater. I want her to sit in a room with every crew member on her next roster and explain exactly what she did tonight and why it will never happen again. Evelyn nodded slowly. That's unconventional, but effective. And, Adrian added, I want a standing procedure that any crew member who questions a passenger's seating after manifest confirmation has to document the reason in writing before approaching the passenger. That way, we separate genuine security concerns from snap judgments. David Benton finally spoke. That will slow things down in rare but urgent cases. Adrian glanced at him, not as much as grounding a flight does. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable for Adrian. He'd lived through rooms like this before, though rarely as the one delivering the terms rather than receiving them. Kara's voice broke the quiet. I can do the meeting. With the crew. Adrian studied her. There was no defensive tilt in her voice now. No brittle edge, just a flat weariness. Whether it came from realization or resignation, he couldn't tell. Good, Adrian said. Because if we're going to keep flying together, passengers need to see that when the airline makes a wrong call, it doesn't hide it in a file cabinet. Victor closed his notebook. We have what we need for tonight. The formal record will follow. Evelyn stood, smoothing her skirt. I'll handle the paperwork. David, coordinate with scheduling for the crew meeting. Kara remained seated. For a moment, she looked like she might speak again, but instead, she lowered her gaze and stayed silent. Adrian rose, slinging his bag over his shoulder. I'm flying again in 2 days. I'll be watching to see if the new procedure is in effect. Victor gave him a short nod. It will be. As Adrian stepped out of the conference room, the cool air of the terminal hit him again. The glass walls reflected the parked aircraft in the dark, its tail fin lit against the night sky. For the first time that day, he allowed himself a single, quiet breath of release. This wasn't closure. It wasn't supposed to be. It was the opening of a crack in a wall that had been standing for too long. And once a wall cracks, it can be broken. The following morning, Adrian Cole sat at his kitchen table in Manhattan with a steaming mug of coffee and his laptop open. The city outside was still shaking off the dawn haze. Traffic was light, and the hum of the street below was muted. His inbox had exploded overnight. Messages from Skybridge executives, a dozen meeting invites, and unexpectedly emails from strangers. Some were passengers who had been on Flight 218. Others were employees he had never met. Each message carried a variation of the same theme. I saw what happened. I've seen it before. Thank you for not letting it slide. One email stood out. It came from a junior gate agent in Dallas named Monica Reyes. You don't know me, but I've been in Kara's position told to verify certain passengers based on nothing but a gut feeling. Sometimes I've been the only one to push back. Sometimes I didn't, and I regret it. I hope they actually changed the training. Adrian read it twice. It was the kind of message that cut through corporate formality, raw and unpolished, but real. A notification pinged. Victor Liang calling. Adrian answered on speaker. You're trending, Victor said without preamble. Adrian raised an eyebrow. I didn't post anything. You didn't have to, Victor replied. 2 passengers did. One of them was the retired teacher Marilyn Frost. She wrote a detailed Facebook post last night. It's already been shared 15,000 times. Adrian could imagine Marilyn's crisp, no-nonsense voice in her writing. And the other, some guy in 40 financial analyst, big following on LinkedIn. His post is more pointed. He tagged Skybridge, said the company stepped up only because the CEO happened to be the target. That one's catching traction, too. Adrian sipped his coffee. He's not wrong. I know, Victor said. Corporate knows, too. That's why Comms is drafting a statement. What's it say, Adrian asked. Nothing worth saying yet, Victor admitted. It's the usual blend of we value diversity and we regret any misunderstanding. Adrian's mouth tightened. If they use the word misunderstanding, they're telling everyone nothing happened. Victor hesitated. You want me to push back, no? Adrian said. I'll do it. After the call ended, Adrian opened a blank document. His fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before he began typing. The words came quickly, without the corporate filter, direct, precise, and impossible to soften without losing their weight. On Flight 218, a decision was made based not on procedure, but on perception. I was asked to prove my place, despite already being confirmed. That decision could have been made about anyone. The fact that it was made about me, and that I have the title I do, only proves how deeply embedded these judgments are. He kept writing until he had something that felt like a statement, but read like a conversation, personal, specific, and focused on what needed to change, not just what had happened. Before he could hit save, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Talia Morgan. I've been thinking about what you said, that patience isn't passive. I saw Kara in the crew lounge this morning. She didn't say much, but she looked different, not defensive, just quiet. I think she's processing. Adrian replied, processing is good, change is better. By mid-afternoon. Skybridge's official account posted their statement. It was cleaner than Victor had described, but still leaned too heavily on vague language. Adrian's own post went live an hour later. Within minutes, it was being shared across platforms. The comments piled up, some supportive, some defensive, some openly hostile. He didn't read them all. He didn't need to. What mattered was that the conversation had moved beyond a single flight. That evening, he walked into a corporate town hall meeting held in the top-floor conference space at Skybridge headquarters. The glass walls here overlooked the East River, the city lights glittering beyond. Inside, the mood was cautious. Executives sat in a semicircle, and a camera crew streamed the session to employees nationwide. Evelyn Shaw opened the meeting. We're here to discuss not only the incident on Flight 218, but the broader implications for our culture and training. She gestured toward Adrian. Adrian has agreed to speak first. Adrian stood, buttoning his jacket. He looked around the room, then into the camera. I've heard from more than 30 employees since that Flightgate agents, crew, customer service reps. They've shared stories that never made it into incident reports. Stories about passengers singled out because they didn't fit the profile. He let the words hang for a moment before continuing. Some of those stories end with an apology. Most end with silence. And the silence is the problem. We've created a system where the appearance of compliance is valued more than the reality of fairness. A few executives shifted in their seats. Adrian went on. Changing training modules won't fix this by itself. We need accountability that is visible, not just procedural. That's why I've asked that any seating verification beyond manifest confirmation requires written justification. And I've asked that when we get it wrong. We address it openly, not to humiliate, but to demonstrate. From the back of the room, a voice spoke up. It was a senior flight attendant with 30 years in the air. If we do that, you know some crew will be afraid to make calls even when they should. Adrian nodded. Then we need to teach the difference between instinct and bias. We can't afford to pretend they're the same thing. There was a murmur of agreement. Evelyn leaned forward. Adrian, would you be willing to lead a series of discussions with crew and ground staff? Not as the CEO, but as the passenger from 2A. Adrian smiled faintly. That's exactly who I intend to be in those rooms. After the meeting, Victor joined him in the hallway. You realize you just signed yourself up for months of travel, right? Adrian shrugged. Better to spend months on the road than years cleaning up after the same mistakes. Outside, the city noise was louder now. Horns, voices, the low rumble of traffic over the bridges. Adrian stepped into the cool air, feeling the same steady resolve that had carried him through the flight. The story wasn't over. It was only getting louder. 2 days later, Adrian Cole walked through the glass doors of Skybridge Airlines' Chicago Training Center. The building smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the kind of scent that clung to places where people were taught rules and drilled in procedure. Victor Liang had arranged the first of the crew discussion sessions here. 25 seats were set up in a semicircle facing a simple lectern. There was no stage, no podium, just space for people to see each other. Adrian arrived early, placing his leather bag on one of the empty chairs instead of the table. He didn't want any physical distance from the crew. As they filed in, flight attendants in uniform, trainers in polo shirts with the Skybridge logo, a few pilots in casual clothes, he greeted them individually. Some shook his hand firmly. Others avoided eye contact. By the time the last seat filled, the air in the room had shifted, not hostile, but charged like the moments before takeoff when the engines spool up and you feel the potential for motion. Adrian stepped to the front, hands loosely clasped. "I'm not here as your CEO today," he began. "I'm here as the passenger in Seat 2A on Flight 218. A ripple of recognition moved through the room. Even those who hadn't been following the internal bulletins knew enough of the story to picture the moment. "I want to be clear," Adrian continued. "This isn't a disciplinary meeting. No one here is on trial. But this is a room where we tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." A flight attendant in the second row raised her hand. "Sir, some of us feel like we're already guilty before we walk in here." Adrian nodded. "I understand. That's not my goal. My goal is to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else and to figure out how we get there together." A man in the back crossed his arms. "With all due respect, you're the CEO. You could have ended that flight before it took off. Most of us don't have that kind of pull." Adrian met his gaze. "You're right. I have authority most passengers don't. But authority didn't stop what happened. What stopped it was visibility. Everyone could see it, and once they saw it, it couldn't be ignored." He let that sit for a beat before continuing. "We talk a lot about procedures. Procedures are there to keep people safe. But when we start bending them to fit personal expectations, they stop being protection and start being weapons." A woman near the aisle spoke up. "I've been told by supervisors to double-check certain passengers. We all know what that means, even if no one says it outright." There was a murmur of agreement. Adrian leaned forward slightly. "And how many of you have pushed back on that 3 hands went up hesitant? Halfway." "That's 3 too few," Adrian said, not accusing, but stating it plainly. "And I get it. You're worried about being labeled difficult, about losing hours, losing rotes. But every time we go along with it, we reinforce the idea that the bias is justified." A senior trainer, gray hair pulled back tightly, spoke from the side. "Some crew think they're just being proactive. If something feels off, they act. Isn't that what we're taught? Feeling off isn't the same as noticing a real risk." Adrian said. "And part of being a professional is knowing the difference." From the back row, another voice, softer, almost reluctant, cut in. "When I started 10 years ago, I watched a lead attendant move a young black man out of first class because she didn't see his name on the manifest. Turned out she was looking at the wrong flight's list. She never apologized. I didn't say anything. I still think about it." The room went still. Adrian stepped away from the lectern and into the semicircle. "That's why we're here. Not just to talk about my flight, but about the moments we've all seen and stayed silent on. Those moments build into a culture, and culture is harder to change than any policy." One of the pilots shifted forward in his chair. "If you start documenting every seat verification, people are going to slow down the process. It's going to cause delays." "Maybe," Adrian said, "but the alternative is that people keep making unchecked calls that cost us more than time. We can recover from a delay. We can't recover from passengers deciding they don't trust us." He scanned the room. "This isn't about turning you into robots who follow scripts. It's about making sure when you act, you're acting for the right reason, and that you can explain that reason if you're asked." Silence stretched again. Then the woman who'd spoken earlier about double-checking. Certain passengers raised her hand a second time. "If the policy changes, will supervisors be held to the same standard?" "Yes," Adrian said without hesitation. "If anything, the bar will be higher for supervisors. They set the tone. If they bend the rules, they give everyone else permission to." The man in the back, who had crossed his arms earlier, finally spoke again. "So what happens if we call something out and we're wrong? Are we still in trouble?" "Being wrong isn't the problem," Adrian said. "Refusing to own it is. If you make a call in good faith and it turns out to be a mistake, you correct it openly, you apologize, and then you move on, better than before. That's professionalism." The tension in the room eased slightly, not gone, but shifted from resistance to cautious engagement. Adrian closed the session by asking each person to write down one thing they'd seen or experienced in the last year that made them question whether the airline truly treated all passengers equally. No names, no dates required, just moments. As they filed out, several people stopped to speak to him quietly. One thanked him for not talking down to the crew. Another admitted she'd been skeptical about the meeting, but felt heard. When the room was empty, Adrian sat alone for a moment, reading the first few slips of paper. The stories varied, some blatant, some subtle, all carrying the weight of lived experience. He knew they would be harder to fix than any single policy. But as he folded the papers and placed them in his bag, he felt something shift. The wall wasn't just cracked now, it was starting to crumble. 3 days after the Chicago session, Adrian Cole sat in his office on the 42nd floor of Skybridge headquarters. The Hudson River stretched beyond the glass, its surface dotted with slow-moving barges and the glint of afternoon sunlight. Victor Liang came in without knocking, a folded copy of the New York Herald under his arm. He dropped it onto Adrian's desk. "Page A3, Victor said. Adrian unfolded the paper. There, under the headline, "Skybridge CEO Confronts Bias in the Skies," was a photo of him standing in front of the semicircle of crew in Chicago. The shot was candid, mid-sentence, his hands open as if making a point. "They had a photographer in the room?" Adrian asked, though it wasn't really a question. Victor shook his head. "No. Someone took it on their phone. Probably one of the crew. It made its way to a reporter before comms could get ahead of it." Adrian read the first few paragraphs. The article didn't just recount the Flight 218 incident, it described the meeting in Chicago, quoting anonymous attendees who said the CEO spoke more like a fellow passenger than an executive and that things got uncomfortably honest. Victor watched him. This could go either way. Some people will see it as leadership. Others will call it performative. Let them call it whatever they want, Adrian said, folding the paper neatly. The only thing worse than this getting out is it never getting out at all. The phone on his desk buzzed. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "CNN is asking for a live interview tonight. They want you on their primetime business segment." Victor raised an eyebrow. "You planning to do it?" Adrian leaned back in his chair. "If I don't, they'll just fill the airtime with someone else's version. By evening." Adrian was sitting under the hot lights of a midtown studio, a small microphone clipped to his lapel. Across from him, the anchor smiled politely while a producer counted down in his earpiece. "Mr. Cole," the anchor began. "Your handling of the Flight 218 incident has sparked national conversation. Some praise your directness. Others say you're using your position to push a personal agenda. How do you respond?" Adrian didn't flinch. "If my personal agenda is making sure every passenger is treated with equal respect, then I'll own that without apology. What happened to me isn't unique. The only unique part is that I was in a position to do something about it." The anchor tilted her head. "Some crew members have expressed concerns that your new documentation policy will slow down their work and create fear of making judgment calls." Adrian's reply was measured. Good judgment doesn't fear documentation. If a call is necessary and justified, writing it down only strengthens the decision. If it's not justified, then it shouldn't have been made in the first place. The segment ran for 8 minutes, ending with a clip of Adrian saying, "The sky doesn't belong to one kind of passenger, and neither do we." By the time he left the studio, his phone was buzzing with messages. Talia Morgan had sent a brief text. "You just made half the crew proud and the other half nervous. That's how you know you're hitting the truth." The next morning, Skybridge's internal chat system lit up. Crew members posted links to the interview, debating it openly. Some called Adrian's stance overdue. Others argued he was undermining the authority of frontline staff. In the middle of the chatter, a new message appeared from an account labeled simply Gate Agent, ATL. It read, "If anyone thinks bias checks only happen in the air, come watch what happens at the boarding gate. Glad someone's finally saying it out loud." Evelyn Shaw forwarded the comment to Adrian with a note. "The ripple's reaching places we've never touched before." That same afternoon, a major travel blogger published a piece titled, "When the Passenger is the Boss Inside Skybridge's Cultural Reckoning." The article quoted passengers from past flights who had experienced similar treatment, weaving their stories into the broader narrative. It also hinted that some supervisors inside Skybridge were quietly resisting the changes, seeing them as a challenge to authority. Adrian read the piece carefully. The blogger wasn't wrong. He'd heard whispers from Victor about certain regional managers grumbling that Cole's crusade was making their jobs harder. That night, he called Victor. "We're not waiting for this to fester," Adrian said. "Set up a meeting with every regional manager virtual if we have to. I want it this week." "Some of them won't be happy to see you," Victor warned. Adrian's voice was steady. "They don't have to be happy. They have to be clear." 2 days later, the virtual meeting lit up Adrian's screen with 22 small video windows, each showing a manager in their respective office. Some looked attentive. A few looked openly skeptical. "I'll get right to it," Adrian began. "If you think these changes are optional, you're wrong. If you think they're temporary, you're wrong. This isn't a PR cycle. It's a shift in how we operate." A manager from Los Angeles spoke up first. "We're already stretched thin. Adding paperwork is going to push us over." "Then you need to rethink how you manage your resources," Adrian said, "because the cost of not doing this is higher than the cost of the time it takes." From Atlanta, another voice. "What if passenger complaints spike because crew hesitate to act?" "They might," Adrian admitted, "but I'd rather have complaints about slowness than complaints about discrimination. One we can explain, the other we can't defend." The room, or rather, the screen was quiet for a long moment. Then a manager from Boston leaned forward. "I saw the CNN segment. Whether we like it or not, the public's watching. We can either adapt or get left behind." A few nods appeared in the other windows. Not all, but enough. When the meeting ended, Adrian closed his laptop and sat in the quiet of his office. The city hummed beyond the glass, indifferent to corporate struggles, but he felt the weight of something shifting, not fast, not all at once, but undeniably moving. His phone buzzed again, another email, this one from Marilyn Frost. It was short. "I saw the interview. Keep going. Some of us have been waiting for years to hear those words from someone in your seat." Adrian smiled faintly. He didn't know exactly where this would end, but he knew one thing: the days of silent flights were over. It was a Thursday morning when Adrian Cole boarded a Skybridge flight from New York to Seattle. This wasn't a planned trip. It was a last-minute decision after Victor called to tell him about a brewing personnel issue in the airline's West Coast operations. The cabin was calm as passengers settled in. Adrian had chosen a seat in the middle of business class, 6E this time, deliberately avoiding the front row. He wanted a different vantage point, one that let him observe without immediately being noticed. 15 minutes into boarding, he caught a change in the cabin's rhythm. The flow of passengers slowed. A murmur ran through the aisle. Adrian looked up to see a middle-aged black woman standing just ahead of row 7, her carry-on dangling from her hand. She was speaking to a young flight attendant, whose expression was polite but firm. "I'm in 6D, the woman said, holding out her boarding pass. The attendant glanced at it, then back at her. "Ma'am, this is a premium seat. Are you sure this is yours?" The woman's voice tightened. "It's my name on the pass. Why wouldn't it be mine?" Adrian's chest tightened. He knew this rhythm too well. The attendant shifted her weight. "I just need to check with my supervisor before you sit down." "Is there a problem?" the woman asked. "It'll just take a moment," the attendant replied, already turning toward the galley. The woman stayed frozen in the aisle, the space around her widening as other passengers edged back to give her room. The air changed eyes averted, tension unspoken but sharp. Adrian rose from his seat. "Excuse me," he said, stepping into the aisle. "I believe that's the seat next to mine." The woman glanced at him, surprised but grateful for the interruption. "Apparently, it's under review," she said dryly. Adrian turned to the attendant, who was halfway down the aisle. "I'd like to hear why you're verifying her seat when boarding passes are already scanned at the gate." The attendant hesitated. "Sir, I was just following procedure." Adrian finished for her. "Because the procedure says seat assignments are confirmed before the passenger steps on board." By now, the cabin had gone quiet. A few phones were angled discreetly, passengers pretending not to record. The lead flight attendant emerged from the galley, a man in his 40s with a clipped tone. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes," Adrian said evenly. "Your crew member is questioning a passenger seat without cause. And from where I'm standing, it looks like the only reason is how she looks." The lead attendant stiffened. "Sir, we have the right to verify seating if necessary." Adrian met his gaze. "Then I assume you'll be documenting this verification per the new policy." O flicker crossed the man's face, recognition, then discomfort. "You're Mr. Cole." "That's right," Adrian said, "and this policy exists to prevent exactly this." The woman still stood in the aisle, her hand tightening on her carry-on handle. Adrian turned to her. "Please, have your seat." She slid into 6D without another word, but her jaw was set, eyes focused straight ahead. Adrian sat beside her, the lead attendant retreating toward the galley without further comment. As the last passengers boarded, the hum of conversation slowly returned, but the incident had left a mark. The woman exhaled finally and turned toward Adrian. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't expect anyone to step in." "You shouldn't have needed anyone to," Adrian replied. "I'm sorry you did." The flight took off on time, but Adrian's mind didn't leave the first 10 minutes of boarding. He'd been pushing for cultural change for weeks, and yet here it was, an almost identical scenario, on his own airline, after every memo and meeting. 2 hours into the flight, he asked the lead attendant to join him in the galley. "I want to hear your reasoning," Adrian said. The man shifted uncomfortably. "We've had a few passengers on this route try to switch seats without paying the upgrade fee. I just wanted my crew to be cautious." "Caution doesn't mean targeting certain passengers," Adrian said. "The moment you start applying it unevenly, it's not caution, it's bias." The attendant's shoulders dropped slightly. "I didn't tell her to single anyone out." Then you need to make sure your crew knows what even-handed looks like, Adrian said, because every time this happens, we lose more than money. We lose trust. And trust is the only thing keeping someone from choosing another airline. Back in his seat, Adrian opened his laptop and began typing a detailed incident report not as CEO, but as a passenger witness. He included the exact dialogue, the timestamps, and the reactions in the cabin. He wanted this to be more than another verbal warning. When the plane landed in Seattle, the woman in 6D paused at the terminal entrance. "My name's Janine Walters," she said. "If you ever need someone to speak about this publicly, I will." Adrian nodded. "I may take you up on that." As he walked through the terminal, Victor's voice was already in his ear from a quick call. "I heard about the boarding. There's chatter from passengers on social media." "Let it chatter," Adrian said. "This is proof the work isn't done. And it won't be until the next Janine Walters walks on board and is greeted like every other passenger in the cabin." 1 week after the Seattle flight, Adrian Cole stood on the stage of a modest auditorium in Washington. The event had been organized in a rush, a joint panel between Skybridge Airlines and a national passenger rights coalition. The room was filled with reporters, airline employees, and travelers who had lived their own quiet versions of what had happened on Flight 218. On the front row sat Janine Walters, composed but alert. She'd agreed to speak after a long phone call with Adrian the day after their flight. He had asked her not as a CEO trying to salvage his airline's image, but as a fellow passenger who wanted her voice in the record. When the moderator finished the introductions, Adrian stepped forward. He wasn't in a tailored suit this time, but in a simple navy sweater and slacks. He wanted the message to come from the man, not the position. "I've told this story before," he began, "but I need to tell it here, in this room, because too often stories like it stay in whispers. On Flight 218, I was told to verify a seat I'd already been assigned. It wasn't about security. It wasn't about procedure. It was about perception. And that perception was shaped by who I am and how I look." He let the words settle before continuing. "Since then, I've spoken to dozens of our crew. I've read hundreds of accounts from passengers, some spanning decades. They all point to the same truth: bias can live in places that claim to be neutral. And when it does, it shows itself in small moments that add up to something big." Adrian turned toward Janine. "Last week, Janine Walters boarded a Skybridge flight. She had a seat in business class. She was asked to wait while her seat was verified. It was the same story, different day. And that's why we're here, not to pat ourselves on the back for the progress we've made, but to admit that it isn't enough." Janine stood when the moderator nodded to her. Her voice was steady. "I've been flying for years. I know the rules. I follow them. But in that moment, standing in the aisle while other passengers stared, I was reminded that following the rules isn't always enough. Sometimes, you're asked to prove you belong before you're allowed to sit down. That's not a small thing. That's a crack in the foundation." The audience was silent, leaning into her words. After Janine sat, Adrian took the mic again. "This isn't about vilifying crew. It's about building a system where the right call is the easy call and the wrong call can't hide behind habit or hunch. That's why starting next month, Skybridge will roll out mandatory scenario-based training for all crew and supervisors. Every seating verification will require documentation, no exceptions. And those reports will be audited by a new independent review board made up of employees from every level, not just management." A hand shot up from the press row. "Mr. Cole, Some critics say you're making the airline less efficient and creating unnecessary delays. How do you respond? Adrian didn't hesitate. If efficiency comes at the expense of fairness, then it's not efficiency, it's expedience. And expedience has no place in deciding who deserves respect. Another question came. Are you concerned about backlash from within your own company? I expect it, Adrian said plainly. Change doesn't come without resistance. But I also expect that the people who work here want to be part of something better than the way things have always been. After the panel ended, clusters of people stayed to talk. Some employees approached Adrian quietly, thanking him. A few admitted they'd been skeptical, but had changed their minds. Janine was surrounded by passengers sharing their own experiences, the beginnings of something like a network forming around her. Later that evening, Adrian returned to his hotel room overlooking the Potomac. The city lights blinked against the dark water. He loosened his collar and sat by the window, letting the quiet settle. He thought of the first-time Seat 2A, Kara Whitfield's polite but loaded request, the weight of every pair of eyes in that cabin. He thought of Chicago, of slips of paper with unspoken truths written in hurried handwriting. He thought of Janine, standing in the aisle of 6D, steady under scrutiny she didn't deserve. He realized then that his fight wasn't just about flights. It was about the spaces people moved through every day, the gates, the cabins, the boardrooms where belonging should be assumed, not granted. The next morning, he flew back to New York. No special arrangements, no priority escort. He walked through the gate like any other passenger, handed over his boarding pass, and took his seat in row 8. This time, no one questioned it, and yet, he knew the work wasn't over. Change didn't happen in one flight, one meeting, or one policy. It happened in the accumulation of moments when someone chose to act differently than they would have before. As the engines roared to life, Adrian looked out the window at the runway lights blurring into motion. He thought of the countless flights still ahead, each one an opportunity to make the sky feel like it belonged to everyone. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming passengers and thanking them for choosing Skybridge. Adrian smiled faintly, knowing that for once, those words carried just a little more truth than they had before. Some stories end when the plane lands. This one doesn't. Adrian Cole's fight wasn't about a single flight. It was about rewriting the unspoken rules that decide who belongs and who doesn't. It was about turning moments of silent humiliation into moments of undeniable change. We leave you with this every time we choose to stay silent in the face of bias. We help it grow. And every time we choose to speak, we make it harder for it to survive. The sky should belong to everyone. No conditions, no exceptions. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, made you think, or made you hope, let it be more than just a story you heard. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it into the spaces where silence has lived for too long. And remember, there are more stories like this waiting to be told, stories that will make you feel, question, and act. Like, share, and subscribe so you'll be here when the next one takes flight.